By the early 1970s, federal investigators believed one man stood at the center of a heroin network larger than almost anything they had seen. Shipments had been intercepted, dealers arrested, cash flows traced across cities and state lines. Every lead bent toward a single point of control. Yet when authorities finally moved to seize the man responsible, they arrived too late. There was no arrest, no body, no verified escape route, only silence. That silence carried a name locked inside sealed files: Frank Matthews. Before becoming a legend defined by absence, Matthews lived a life that barely registered. He was not born powerful, protected, or connected. He grew up surrounded by limits, economic, social, and invisible ones that were understood without being spoken. The streets educated him early. Effort did not always equal reward. Obedience did not ensure safety. Many who followed the rules remained trapped anyway. Matthews noticed what others missed. The loud men disappeared. The flashy ones attracted attention. Attention brought consequences. The people who survived longest were careful, quiet, almost invisible. They moved without urgency and spoke without excess. From a young age, Matthews learned that survival favored restraint, not bravado. That lesson would shape everything that followed. As Matthews grew older, the gap between labor and security widened. Jobs came and went. Paychecks barely moved. Advancement felt theoretical, not real. Each attempt to move forward ended the same way, with closed doors and shrinking patience. The message was consistent. Power lived elsewhere. By his early 20s, Matthews faced the same crossroads as many around him. Accept a future built on waiting, or step outside the rules and claim agency directly. This was not rebellion or thrill-seeking. It was calculation. Matthews did not crave chaos. He wanted predictability. He wanted control over outcomes that society seemed unwilling to offer him. The drug trade surrounded him. Heroin moved openly through cities, tearing families apart in daylight. Addiction was visible everywhere. But Matthews didn't see drugs the way others did. He saw structure, a market governed by supply, demand, routes, and access. Where most focused on street corners, Matthews focused upstream. His early moves were clumsy. Deals failed. Partners lied. Money vanished. These losses embarrassed him. But more importantly, they educated him. Trust was expensive. Emotion blurred judgment. Speed brought profit, but patience brought survival. Instead of reacting with force, Matthews adjusted. He reduced exposure, observed longer, spoke less. Failure didn't harden him. It sharpened him. Most dealers fought over territory. Matthews asked a different question. Who controls the supply? He understood that power didn't sit on street corners. It lived at the top of the chain. Those who controlled access controlled everyone below them. That realization changed his trajectory. Instead of competing locally, Matthews looked outward, beyond neighborhoods, beyond cities. He studied how heroin entered the country. Routes watched closely and routes ignored. He identified which connections endured and which collapsed under pressure. Slowly, cautiously, he formed relationships far removed from the street trade. These alliances carried enormous risk. One misstep could cost his life. Matthews accepted that risk as necessary. When he finally secured access to large quantities, everything shifted. He was no longer dependent, no longer replaceable. He dictated terms. Prices dropped for those loyal to him. Loyalty followed naturally. Yet Matthews avoided visibility. He dressed plainly, lived quietly. To neighbors, he seemed ordinary. This anonymity was deliberate. He understood that the spotlight destroyed criminal leaders faster than law enforcement ever could. As the operation expanded, Matthews built layers. Street dealers knew nothing of suppliers. Couriers knew destinations, not origins. Each person held only what they needed. Arrests damaged the edges, never the core. Investigations slowed. Frustration grew. The system worked until it didn't. Money flowed fast, but Matthews treated it carefully. He avoided obvious displays, spread wealth across locations, moved funds constantly. He planned for pressure years before it arrived. Survival required preparation long before danger became visible. But success carried consequences he never calculated. Heroin flooded fragile neighborhoods. Addiction deepened. Families collapsed. Hospitals filled. These outcomes followed his operation everywhere, even if he never witnessed them directly. His empire thrived on suffering that remained abstract to him. Law enforcement began noticing something larger. Arrests increased, yet supply never slowed. Seizures felt meaningless against the flow. Investigators began comparing cases. Patterns emerged: packaging, timing, routes. At first the connections were faint. Then they became undeniable. Agencies that once worked separately began sharing information. Charts filled with converging lines. A central figure took shape, though his name remained unknown. Matthews sensed the shift before it reached him. Conversations tightened. Movements slowed. Questions surfaced where none existed before. He didn't panic. These signs confirmed what he already knew. No system lasts forever. Instead of shrinking, Matthews expanded. He believed scale offered protection. Complexity became his armor. More routes, more distance, more separation. That decision marked the moment success began turning into exposure. Money flowed fast, but Matthews treated it carefully. He avoided obvious displays, spread wealth across locations, moved funds constantly. He planned for pressure years before it arrived. Survival required preparation long before danger became visible. But success carried consequences he never calculated. Heroin flooded fragile neighborhoods. Addiction deepened. Families collapsed. Hospitals filled. These outcomes followed his operation everywhere, even if he never witnessed them directly. His empire thrived on suffering that remained abstract to him. Law enforcement began noticing something larger. Arrests increased, yet supply never slowed. Seizures felt meaningless against the flow. Investigators began comparing cases. Patterns emerged: packaging, timing, routes. At first the connections were faint. Then they became undeniable. Agencies that once worked separately began sharing information. Charts filled with converging lines. A central figure took shape, though his name remained unknown. Matthews sensed the shift before it reached him. Conversations tightened. Movements slowed. Questions surfaced where none existed before. He didn't panic. These signs confirmed what he already knew. No system lasts forever. Instead of shrinking, Matthews expanded. He believed scale offered protection. Complexity became his armor. More routes, more distance, more separation. That decision marked the moment success began turning into exposure. As shipments grew, risk multiplied. More people understood that something massive was moving beneath the surface. Rumors spread. Whispers reached informants. Pressure mounted quietly. Then came a fracture, an arrest that asked the wrong questions, a shipment that drew attention, someone under pressure who spoke too much. Information traveled upward, slowly, then faster. For the first time, Frank Matthews' name surfaced in places it never had before. Federal briefings, confidential memos, sealed investigations. The ghost now had an identity. Matthews understood immediately. He didn't wait for confirmation or hope for luck. He began dismantling his presence. Money moved first, then people. Contact dissolved. Meetings stopped. Instructions traveled indirectly. He isolated himself not from fear, but from necessity. Fewer connections meant fewer vulnerabilities. Law enforcement believed they were closing in. Warrants were drafted. Surveillance expanded. Raid scheduled. Officials felt days away from a historic arrest. When they moved, they found emptiness. Safe houses were abandoned. Accounts drained. Routes dead. The man at the center was gone. No witnesses. No trail. No explanation. Frank Matthews had vanished. The disappearance stunned investigators and the public alike. Headlines announced one of the largest heroin operations ever uncovered. Yet the central figure was missing. Officials promised answers. None came. No confirmed flight records surfaced. No reliable sightings followed. No proof of death emerged. Only silence. That silence became the most unsettling part of the story. Matthews had not been captured. He had not been publicly killed. He had removed himself entirely, leaving no resolution behind. What remained was absence. An empire collapsed in fragments. Communities continued to suffer the damage. Investigators faced files filled with unanswered questions. Frank Matthews left no confession, no body, no final chapter anyone could point to with certainty. As Frank Matthews' operation moved beyond survival and into dominance, the shape of his world changed. This was no longer about escaping poverty or proving control over his own life. It became about balance, maintaining equilibrium at a scale few ever reached. Power, once achieved, demanded constant attention. Matthews understood that power carried gravity. Everything near it began to pull inward. By the early 1970s, his network extended far beyond any single city. Routes crossed multiple states. Couriers moved with precision. Distribution followed schedules that rarely slipped. The danger was not speed, but consistency. Drugs arrived when expected. Payments were punctual. There were no sudden disruptions to invite scrutiny. To those inside the system, it felt orderly. To outsiders, it was nearly invisible. Matthews believed stability was protection. Chaos attracted questions. Calm discouraged them. He reorganized the operation like a business. Roles were defined tightly. Everyone had limits. Street sellers knew nothing beyond their immediate tasks. Couriers asked no questions. Middlemen were isolated from one another. Matthews remained far from the surface, separated by layers meant to absorb damage. If one section failed, the rest could continue. Growth came without visibility, and that invisibility was intentional. As profits increased, Matthews resisted temptation. He did not live extravagantly. He avoided habits that formed patterns. He understood that law enforcement often followed routine, and routine required visibility. A quiet man was harder to trace than a celebrated one. Money moved constantly. Matthews did not trust accumulation. Large sums in one place created risk. Wealth was divided, relocated, converted, concealed. Some was reinvested. Some was reserved for emergencies. To Matthews, money mattered only if it could move when needed. Within the drug world, his reputation grew. People spoke of him carefully, not with admiration, but respect mixed with caution. Matthews was known for order. Violence was controlled, not chaotic. Disputes were handled quietly. Mistakes carried consequences, but disorder was avoided. This balance kept attention low and loyalty high. Yet growth created pressure. The more people involved, the more fragile trust became. Matthews limited personal relationships. Even longtime associates remained at a distance. Familiarity, he believed, bred vulnerability. Emotional bonds blurred judgment. Control demanded distance. Distance created isolation. Surrounded by movement, Matthews stood alone, making decisions without counsel, carrying doubts without relief. There was no room for weakness at the center. While Matthews focused on maintaining balance, law enforcement began sensing weight. Arrests continued, yet supply never slowed. Every disrupted route was replaced. The patterns did not match typical operations. This was not a loose collection of dealers. It was a system. Investigators started comparing cases across jurisdictions. Similar packaging appeared in different cities. Identical distribution methods resurfaced repeatedly. At first, these links seemed coincidental. Over time, they became impossible to ignore. Matthews sensed tension but not coordination. Scrutiny was expected. What he did not yet see was collaboration. Agencies that once worked alone were now sharing information. Lines were being drawn between cases that had never been connected before. As pressure increased, Matthews made a critical decision. Instead of slowing down, he expanded. He believed size created leverage. The larger the system, the more difficult it would be to dismantle. Complexity, in his mind, was armor. The expansion delivered short-term gains. Shipments increased. Profits grew, but so did exposure. More people became involved. More opportunities for error emerged. Matthews accepted the risk, confident his structure could absorb it. That confidence would soon be tested. The first warnings arrived quietly. A courier delayed longer than expected. A shipment drew unusual attention. An arrest involved quantities that raised questions. None seemed catastrophic alone. Together, they formed a signal. Matthews tightened control. Communication narrowed. Meetings were reduced. Instructions passed through fewer hands. Loyalty was tested subtly. Hesitation noted, fear observed. Matthews understood that pressure exposed weakness. Inside the organization, anxiety spread. Associates sensed a shift. Some asked questions Matthews refused to answer. Others considered stepping away. Fear does not guarantee betrayal, but makes it possible. Law enforcement pressure intensified. Informants were approached. Financial trails were examined. Investigators followed money instead of people, tracing paths that moved steadily toward the center. Matthews' name was not public, but it circulated quietly among officials. This was the most dangerous phase of his rise. He stood at his peak, yet more exposed than ever. Success had narrowed his options. Retreat suggested weakness. Expansion risked collapse. Matthews chose to hold position. The crime attributed to him was not violence. It was scale. The volume of heroin moving through his network exceeded anything authorities had documented. When investigators grasped its size, the response changed. This was no longer local. It was national. Media attention followed. Reporters described an unseen force feeding addiction across cities. The absence of a visible leader unsettled the public. People fear what they cannot see. Communities demanded accountability. Politicians promised action. Law enforcement leaders faced mounting pressure to deliver results. Matthews felt this indirectly as behavior around him changed. Some became paralyzed by caution. Others grew reckless. Both were dangerous. The turning point came when information aligned. Arrests, financial records, and informant statements converged. For the first time, investigators believed they had identified the center. Matthews' name appeared in confidential briefings. Surveillance plans formed. Warrants were prepared. This was the moment Matthews had always anticipated. He did not panic. He did not retaliate. He did not negotiate. He activated the contingency he had planned for years. Matthews understood the empire could not survive full exposure, but he did not need to fall with it. The structure could collapse without him. Survival required separation. He began withdrawing quietly. Decisions were delegated. Contact reduced. Money moved beyond reach. Final instructions passed through trusted intermediaries without explanation. Matthews erased himself deliberately, piece by piece. Law enforcement accelerated, unaware of how late they were. Raids were planned. Surveillance tightened. Officials felt momentum building. The sense of closure was near. Then everything stopped. When authorities moved, Matthews was gone. Safe locations were empty. Trails ended abruptly. The operation was exposed, but its architect had vanished. The public learned through headlines describing a massive drug empire and a missing kingpin. Even seasoned investigators were stunned. How could someone so deeply embedded disappear without evidence? Speculation filled the void. Some believed Matthews fled abroad. Others believed betrayal ended his life. A few believed this ending had been planned from the start. None could be proven. What remained was aftermath. Arrests multiplied. Routes collapsed. Assets were seized. The system unraveled without its center. Yet Matthews remained untouched. His rise transformed into absence. He reached the height of influence and stepped away entirely, leaving no resolution behind. Section 2 ends not with triumph, but tension. A man at peak power, sensing the storm, choosing silence over confrontation. The empire still stood, but its foundation had already been removed, and the world was about to discover how empty that foundation truly was. As the empire Matthews built began to fracture, the pressure around him changed in tone. It was no longer distant or abstract. It became personal. It crept into every conversation, every pause, every delay. The system that once felt controlled now felt watched. Matthews had prepared for this phase for years, yet preparation never removes fear. It only teaches you how to hide it. Federal attention was no longer scattered. It was focused. Agencies that once protected their own investigations now shared information freely. What once appeared as isolated incidents were connected by dates, routes, and money. Investigators were no longer asking whether a central figure existed. They were asking how close they were to reaching him. Matthews sensed the shift instinctively. He noticed how quickly information traveled, how often names repeated, how confidence drained from voices that once spoke without hesitation. He understood the psychology of collapse. When people feel protected, they remain calm. When protection weakens, fear spreads faster than truth. Inside his organization, that fear began to surface. Associates became cautious. Some asked questions Matthews refused to answer. Others avoided contact altogether. Loyalty, he realized, could only stretch so far before it began to tear. Law enforcement used that fear carefully. They did not rush. They waited. Pressure was applied to the weakest points, not to break the system, but to observe how it bent. Arrests were timed deliberately. Interrogations were prolonged. Silence itself became a weapon. People spoke not because they were threatened, but because uncertainty exhausted them. Money, once Matthews' greatest shield, began turning against him. Large movements drew attention. Hidden assets raised suspicion. Patterns emerged where he believed none existed. Investigators followed these trails patiently, building their case piece by piece. They were no longer chasing rumors. They were assembling structure. Media attention intensified. Stories described an unseen kingpin whose presence was felt everywhere, but confirmed nowhere. The public became fascinated by the idea of a man who could not be found. Matthews had always avoided attention, but now his absence drew it. Public pressure followed quickly. Communities devastated by addiction demanded accountability. Politicians demanded results. Law enforcement leaders faced scrutiny they could no longer deflect. The case grew symbolic. It was no longer only about drugs. It became about authority, credibility, and control. Matthews felt the shift indirectly. Surveillance increased around places he avoided. Questions reached people who once felt untouchable. The margins were shrinking. This was the phase Matthews feared most. Not arrest, not death, exposure. Exposure removed control. Once his name surfaced publicly, every option would narrow. Escape required anonymity, and anonymity was disappearing. He faced a choice: fight the pressure and risk everything, or disengage entirely. Matthews had always believed survival depended on knowing when to let go. Power was not about holding on forever. It was about leaving on your own terms. He began preparing quietly. Communication slowed. Meetings were canceled. Instructions became simpler. Matthews reduced his presence until it was barely felt. He became a shadow inside the structure he built. At the same time, he tested those around him. Small delays, sudden silence, subtle changes. He watched who panicked and who adapted. What he saw confirmed his fears. The system could not withstand much more pressure. Law enforcement, unaware of these internal calculations, accelerated their efforts. Surveillance expanded. Warrants were drafted. Raids coordinated. Momentum felt real. Investigators believed they were closing in. What they did not know was that Matthews had already begun stepping away. Matthews did not announce his exit. He did not explain it. He simply removed himself from the flow of information. Decisions were delegated. Authority blurred. Responsibility became unclear. Confusion spread inside the organization. Without clear leadership, discipline weakened. Mistakes multiplied. Routes were exposed. Arrests increased. The empire began collapsing from within. Matthews observed this unraveling from a distance. He understood it was inevitable. The system depended on his control. Once that control was gone, collapse was only a matter of time. The final days before his disappearance were marked by quiet urgency. Matthews avoided patterns, avoided witnesses, avoided habit. He trusted no one fully. Every movement was deliberate, designed to leave nothing behind. When he vanished, there was no announcement. One day he existed inside the structure he created. The next, he did not. There were no signs of struggle. No public violence. No event to explain it. Just absence. Law enforcement reacted immediately. Searches began. Locations were secured. Associates were questioned. Borders were monitored. Financial systems were examined again. The effort was intense, but unfocused. Matthews had removed the sinner they were chasing. His absence created confusion. Investigators debated possibilities. Had he fled? Had he been killed? Had he hidden in plain sight? Each theory gained supporters. None produced evidence. Meanwhile, the collapse accelerated. Without leadership, trust evaporated. People talked. Routes failed. Money was seized. Arrests followed rapidly. The empire that once operated with precision fell apart in pieces. Yet Matthews remained untouched. This imbalance unsettled everyone. Law enforcement dismantled the system, but not the man. Communities suffered the damage without seeing accountability. History recorded the crimes, but not the ending. Matthews' story transformed. He was no longer just a trafficker. He became a symbol of power without resolution, of control abandoned, of a system that could exist and vanish. His legacy became defined by silence. Silence from witnesses. Silence from records. Silence from the man himself. That silence forced others to fill the gaps with speculation. Some believed he escaped and lived quietly elsewhere. Others believed his life ended in secrecy. Both possibilities remained open. The truth stayed hidden. What is certain is that Matthews' final act matched his entire approach. Control. Distance. Silence. He did not confront the system closing in around him. He stepped away from it. In doing so, he denied investigators closure. He denied history a conclusion. He denied the world an ending it could understand. Frank Matthews did not fall publicly. He did not surrender. He did not explain himself. He disappeared, and that disappearance ensured that his story would never truly end. The years after Frank Matthews vanished were filled with searching, speculation, and frustration. What investigators believed would be the final chapter became a long, unresolved aftermath. His disappearance did not close the case. It expanded it. Every unanswered question created another path to follow, and every dead end deepened the mystery. In the immediate aftermath, law enforcement treated Matthews' absence as temporary. They believed he was nearby, hiding, waiting for pressure to ease. Surveillance intensified around familiar locations. Former associates were questioned repeatedly. Every rumor was examined. Authorities believed time would force a mistake. It never did. Weeks turned into months, and confidence eroded. No sightings were confirmed. No patterns emerged. Matthews did not resurface. Slowly, the tone of the investigation changed. What began as a manhunt became something else entirely. Investigators stopped searching forward and began looking backward. They reviewed old files, revisited earlier arrests, re-examined financial trails they thought they understood. What emerged was not chaos or desperation, but preparation. Matthews had not fled suddenly. He had been positioning himself long before he disappeared. That realization changed how the case was understood. Money became the central focus. Investigators recovered large sums, but they did not match expectations. Based on the scale of the operation, far more wealth should have existed. Where it went remained unclear. Some funds appear to have moved years before Matthews vanished. Others were concealed through methods that left minimal trace. Accounts ended abruptly. Trails dissolved. The gaps suggested long-term planning, not panic. This discovery unsettled investigators. It meant Matthews never believed in permanence. He believed in exits. As time passed, international possibilities gained weight. Agencies contacted foreign counterparts. Lists were shared. Identities cross-checked. Passports flagged. Yet nothing surfaced that could be confirmed. No arrest de broth. No verified new identity. Matthews remained invisible. Public attention fluctuated. Early headlines fixated on the mystery of a missing Kingpin. Over time, without developments, the story faded from daily news. It returned periodically, sparked by anniversaries, documentaries, or fresh theories, but always ended the same way. Questions without answers. The disappearance refused to age into resolution. For communities harmed by Matthew's operation, the disappearance felt hollow. There was no trial, no testimony, no public reckoning. Addiction continued to scar families long after the network collapsed. The man responsible was never held accountable in a visible way. That absence became part of Matthew's legacy. He was not remembered only for what he did, but for what never happened. The ending people expected was denied. Within law enforcement, opinions divided. Some believed Matthews escaped and lived quietly elsewhere, pointing to the lack of evidence of violence. Others believed he was killed, likely by those who feared exposure. Silence, they argued, could also mean death. Without proof, neither theory prevailed. What troubled investigators most was not that Matthews disappeared, but how completely he did so. Most fugitives leave habits, patterns. Traces Matthews left almost nothing. His erasure suggested discipline carried to the end. Over time, the case cooled. Resources shifted. Active searches slowed. The file remained open, but untouched. Matthews became a reference point rather than a target. His case was discussed in training rooms and briefings as an example of how patience and structure could outlast force. Historians later examined his story as a study in modern crime. Matthews did not rule through chaos. He ruled through organization. He did not depend solely on fear. He depended on systems. His disappearance followed the same logic: quiet, planned, final. Yet his story raised ethical tension. Matthews was often described as intelligent and disciplined, but intelligence does not erase harm. His operation fueled addiction on a massive scale. Lives were damaged far beyond what any investigation could record. These consequences remained after he was gone. This tension makes his story difficult to tell. Mystery invites fascination, but fascination risks obscuring cost. Behind every shipment were people whose lives changed permanently. That damage did not vanish with him. His disappearance solved nothing for those left behind. Matthew's legacy exists in two worlds. In one, he is a criminal who escaped justice. In the other, he is evidence of a system that failed to stop him in time. Both are true. Neither offers comfort. As decades passed, his name shifted from active case to historical question. Younger investigators knew him only through files. New audiences encountered him through articles and documentaries. Each retelling added interpretation, but no new facts. The truth may never surface. Matthews may have lived quietly, far removed from the life he once controlled, or his story may have ended suddenly, unseen and unrecorded. Both possibilities remain open. The absence of certainty is the final wound. He left no statement, no explanation, no confession, no justification. He removed himself entirely from a narrative, leaving others to carry the weight of interpretation. History is uncomfortable with stories that reflect